Alright, so we're back with the RTX 4070 Ti in Cyberpunk, and this time I will be doing the ray traced benchmarks. If you are unsure of what's happening, I've split the raster benchmarks and the ray traced benchmarks into two parts just because the videos are getting way too long, and I'll link both the videos to each other in YouTube, if that makes sense. So it'll just be part one and part two, right? So I'm just going to give you an example of what the performance is like at raster, and then we'll test ray tracing. So at the moment we are at 1080p on the ultra preset, no DLSS, no frame generation, and we're getting around 130 140 frames per second in this specific area, depending on how many NPCs are here, but let's just call it 135 frames per second, right? So now if we just enable ray tracing, yeah, the previous video I didn't show the settings, right, just to cut down on the time, but you can see here I know it shows custom, so we'll just select the ultra preset once again and disable any upscaling, and then we'll just enable ray tracing, right? So this is pretty much what I usually do. I enable all ray traced options and select ray traced lighting as medium. Remember, 135 frames per second, and now we're getting 65 frames per second. So ray tracing is extremely demanding in this game, especially if you enable all options, and we basically halved our frame rate here. Sometimes it'll be even less than half our frame rate, just depending on what's happening on the screen. If there's a lot of shadows, like the market area, for instance, there's a lot of lights and a lot of shadows because of the trees there and stuff, it does drop below 50% of our initial performance. So ray tracing extremely demanding, and maybe to some not worth it, but luckily there's technologies like DLSS and frame generation which can help you boost your frame rate and get to more acceptable frame rates. So I think DLSS quality should be enough here at 1080p ultra with these ray trace settings, right? I'm not a big fan of using DLSS or any upscaling at 1080p actually. Not that you are probably using this GPU for 1080p gaming, but now you can see we gained around 40 frames per second, right? We went from 60 frames per second to 100 frames per second, and sometimes even 120 frames per second. So this is now prime territory to enable frame generation. As explained in my previous video, just try to get a decent base frame rate before you enable frame generation. Frame generation is not there to take you from 30 to 60 frames per second. It's there to take you from like 90 frames per second to 120 frames per second for a high refresh rate, display motion smoothness. Like, let's put it that way. Right, so our average here is 101 frames per second, so DLSS did a pretty decent job. Our 1% lows are sitting at 73, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 61. So let's just go ahead and enable frame generation with these exact same settings. Once again, I'm just testing all settings here just to give you an idea. Not saying these are recommended settings at all. You can use your hardware exactly how you want, and that's the great thing about PC. So we went from 100 frames per second to 150 frames per second just by enabling frame generation. So there's a lot of people that don't like frame generation, and I understand some of the points made. Like, there are some additional visual artifacts, and it does increase input latency. How much, you might ask? That depends on your base frame rate. If you have 60 frames per second and you enable frame generation, you'll get 90 to 100 frames per second, for example, but your input latency will feel very sluggish. Whereas if you get 100 frames per second, input latency increase will be a lot less noticeable. That's my experience anyway. And it's perfectly fine for single player games. Like, don't use it in multiplayer games. I know the finals have frame generation, and the Call of Duty have frame generation. Like, it's not worth it in those games anyway. But once again, that's just my opinion. All right, so on average here of 159 frames per second, our 1% lows are sitting at 122, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 97. All right, let's move on to 1440p. Alright, so I lied. Before we move on to 1440p, we're still at 1080p here, and the exact same settings, the ultra preset just with the DLSS set to quality. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to enable path tracing with exactly the same settings, right? Remember, we had like 150 frames per second, and just enabling path tracing with the exact same upscaling and frame generation settings. This is actually not too terrible, although it does feel kind of floaty. Floaty meaning like I do start to notice the input latency now. It's not terrible. I mean, we're getting 120 frames per second here with path tracing, and it's the input latency is definitely bearable to me personally. Anyway, I know that even this would bother quite a lot of people out there, and like, no issues with that whatsoever. We all have our preferences. But this is not a terrible experience, except this is a 1080p. This GPU is definitely more targeted towards 1440p. It's supposed to be like a high refresh rate 1440p GPU, and not even getting a very high refresh rate experience here at 1080p with DLSS quality and frame generation when path tracing is used. Alright, but that's just how intensive path tracing is to use. So now that we've got an idea, now we can actually move over to 1440p. Right, we're now at 1440p. I'm just selecting the Ultra preset again and just disabling any upscaling here and just disabling frame generation there. So if I remember correctly, we were getting around 80 frames per second, right? So let's just do that. Sorry, so 84 frames per second without ray tracing. So let's go ahead and do exactly what I did now at 1080p. We'll just enable ray tracing, everything on, and then that lighting on medium. And let's see, this is not going to go well. Okay, so we lost just more than half of our frame rate there. We went from just above 80 frames per second to just below 40 frames per second. And this is pretty much what we had at 4K on the Ultra preset, if you remember, at with no ray tracing, right? So 4K Ultra got us 40 frames per second native resolution. So ray tracing is extremely demanding, even on a 40 series GPUs, unfortunately. And that's the reason why frame generation is there, right? It's to try and mitigate some of the performance losses you do experience by enabling ray tracing. And as you can see, our average there was 38 frames per second, our 1% laser sitting at 28, and our 0.1% laser sitting at 20. So not the best experience ever. All right, so let's see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second here. Right, I think I'm just going to enable DLSS quality here. We don't have anything else enabled. I know that you can enable ray reconstruction and it actually improves the frame rate slightly by a few percent, but I'm seeing very heavy stutters on this particular system when I enable DLSS ray reconstruction. I've got no idea why. It didn't used to do it, but now while recording it's got a lot of stuttering. And quality seems to be the way to go if you are aiming for 60 frames per second, right? So I don't think we'll maintain 60 all the time. It might drop just below 60, but if it does, it probably might not be too much below 60. I'm keeping an eye on that counter there. Actually, it's not terrible. If you are aiming for 60 frames per second, then these settings will definitely work for you. And it's a very good looking game. We're using DLSS quality at 1440p, so not aggressive upscaling at all, and it's doing quite well. Like, it's definitely a pretty big performance bump over native. Sure, you have to use upscaling, but unfortunately that's just the nature of ray tracing, right? So I'm going to just drop this down to DLSS balanced because I want to enable frame generation as well. As I said, this frame rate is just kind of low for frame generation if input latency is an issue for you. But let me just show you what the final frame rate is if you enable frame generation. Yeah, so we'll use the exact same settings. We'll just enable DLSS frame generation. Just make sure that you do change your DLSS back to quality, because that does change when you enable frame generation. So let's just see, around 70 frames per second up to 110 frames per second, right? Not terrible, but the input latency is definitely something to consider. Like, personally, I'd aim for a little bit of a higher base frame rate, just because of the input latency. All right, so let's go down to DLSS balance without frame generation, and then we'll enable frame generation again. All right, so no frame generation, just DLSS balanced, and let's see what we are getting here. Right, so this should keep us well above 60 frames per second at all times, dropping down into the mid 70s there. But I do think we'll probably hover around 80 frames per second throughout this whole benchmark run. And although it might not sound like that big an increase, every little bit helps when you start enabling frame generation to try and mitigate that additional input latency, right? And 80 frames per second, personally, I would aim for 90 frames per second before enabling frame generation, but that would mean I'm just going to reset the numbers because of the stupid autosave. As I said, I can't find a way to disable autosave. Anyway, so our average was around 80 frames per second. I had to reset the numbers there, unfortunately. But 80 frames per second, as I said, personally, I'd recommend 90 frames per second before enabling frame generation just to mitigate some of the additional input latency. But going further down to DLSS performance is also not worth it, in my opinion. We might as well just drop this down to medium or the high settings and we'll get our 90 frames per second, I'm pretty sure. All right, so let's enable frame generation and do a benchmark run. All right, so exact same settings, DLSS balanced, and now just with frame generation enabled. And okay, so we're only getting around 10 frames per second more than what we had, and inside it feels much better because we're getting 130 frames per second, but outside getting 120, 110 frames per second feels floaty. I'm going to keep on using that term. It's just like it just feels like your mouse is not connected to your camera. It's not terrible, right? Like really, it's not. A lot of people will be fine playing like this, and especially if you play with the controller, you'll not notice the input latency at all. But I'm saying it as it is. The input latency is definitely noticeable, and I suggest you try it to see if it actually will bother you or not. All right, so 126 frames per second average. Our 1% lows are sitting at 102, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 80. It was 80 when I said it. Anyway, so I do think that dropping down to the high preset will give us a little bit of a performance boost and a much better experience when it comes to input latency. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so at 1440p on the high preset with no upscaling, no frame generation, we're getting 90 something frames per second, 93 let's call it. So let's see what happens once we start enabling ray tracing. Once again, just going to do exactly the same. I know these aren't playable settings because I mean, you do need some upscaling. I'm just showing you what the performance hit is like. So 90 frames per second dropping down. Wow. Okay, so it's even less than half of our original performance. We're down to 37 frames per second again. Not good, like not good at all. This is almost what we had at on the Ultra preset. So not entirely sure what's going on here. So not going to do a full benchmark run here. Let's just see if we can get away with the DLSS quality here to get a decent 60 frames per second experience. Right, so just DLSS quality, the exact same settings. Previously, we were able to get 60 frames per second, but not like it would drop. There's really no difference in performance between the high and the ultra preset when you start enabling ray tracing, and I think the reason for that is some of the settings that make the biggest difference, like screen space reflections, etc., those are now being ray traced. So the performance hit is whether it's on ultra or high, the performance hit is the same. So I think that's what's happening here. So this run would pretty much be the same as our 1440p ultra. All right, but let's rather drop this down to the medium preset and see what actually happens. Right, so on the medium preset, just disabling all that and making sure that it is off. And let's just see. So on high, we got around 90 frames per second. On medium, we are getting 115 frames per second. So a very big increase in the performance here, or in the frame rate. But let's see if that actually translates to the ray traced settings now as well. We were getting just below 40 frames per second at high when ray tracing was enabled. So let's see what happens here. So I'm going to leave everything exactly as it is, just enable ray tracing and select these onto medium. And let's see, once again, below 40 frames per second. So I think we'll be getting the exact same performance whether we use the medium preset or the ultra preset when we start enabling ray tracing. Right, so seeing that we've already done the ray tracing test, like there's not really that much we can change it with these settings. Obviously, if we just go ahead now and let's use the ray tracing medium preset, okay, just without upscaling, okay, because now ray trace reflections are disabled, okay. So we were getting 30 something frames per second. I don't know what's yeah, there we go. It just took a little bit of time, so let's reset the numbers. So we gained 10 to 15% in performance, like going from 37 to 44. So not a big difference once you enable ray tracing, right? Sure, now with the reflections disabled, we are seeing a bit of an increase in performance, but not that much. Right, so seeing that we've already tested all these settings, like that GPU temperature is climbing up rapidly there, almost 80 degrees. But still the GPU clock is sitting at 2805, so not a big issue there. Anyway, so it's very warm here. We're going through another heat wave, so that's why it's very warm in this room. Anyway, so seeing that we've already done all the ray trace testing at the ultra preset, let's revert back to those where we're getting a decent frame rate, and then we start enabling path tracing again. All right, so we selected the ultra preset here. Let's just do DLSS, and we'll use balance. That's where we were. Right, no frame generation, and then we'll just enable ray tracing again. Just want to get a new baseline quickly. I think 80 frames per second or so, right? So 80 to 83 frames per second. All right, so this is without frame generation, 83 frames per second. And now let's enable path tracing here quickly, and it's just right here. So now all the ray traced options will actually disappear because now everything is just set to max. So 83 frames per second drops down to 58 frames per second. So almost 60 frames per second actually. And well, it's dipping below 50 frames per second even. So okay, not really 60 frames per second, not close to a consistent 60 frames per second. So let's just turn around. The frame time graph is extremely smooth though, but that's just because our frame rate is quite low. Not the best experience this at all. Not even close to a consistent 60 frames per second. But if you're aiming for 30 frames per second, lock it to 30 and you'll have a good time. Alright, so let's just see what we actually need to do to get a decent frame rate here. So I'm just going to enable DLSS performance here at 1440p. Although I really don't recommend it. Like we are sacrificing a lot of visual fidelity just to be able to use path tracing, and in my personal opinion, maybe not worth it. Although I do think we should be able to maintain 60 frames per second 99% of the time. Yeah, it might dip below here and there, but so far it seems to be doing quite okay, staying close to that 60 frames per second border. So alright, this is not terrible, but you will start to notice some artifacting, some smearing actually. Some of these faces when we use DLSS performance, it looks like it's covered in glad wrap or cling wrap. I'm not sure what you call it in your country, but plastic wrap. But like, yeah, so DLSS performance might not be the way to go. But unfortunately, that's the only way we can get above 60 frames per second when we start using path tracing. Right, so let's just enable frame generation here. So DLSS ray reconstruction did enable now when we enabled path tracing. I did not see that it was using DLSS ray reconstruction. Sorry about that. It's like a 2 to 3% performance difference, right? So anyway, we'll just use the exact same settings now, just with frame generation enabled. Remember, we were just above 60 frames per second at all times, between 60 and 70, and now we are getting 108 frames per second. Okay, so it'll probably average out to around 100 frames per second. But once again, like even though the frame rate is sitting at 100 frames per second, the motion fluidity is pretty good. The input latency is not horrible. It's noticeable, but it's not horrible. I'm not sure if this is the correct correct way to do it. Anyway, so like this is not the worst experience, and it's not the worst looking experience. It's just that sometimes there will be some visual issues, visual artifacting, and you need to decide whether it's worth it to you or not to enable path tracing. As I said, it's very, very difficult to run. It's very expensive to run. So your choice. All right, enough of 1440p. Let's move on to 4K. Right, so we are at 4K, and this is just the medium preset without any upscaling. So no ray tracing, no nothing, and no frame generation. So let's just see. I thought it's around the 60 frames per second we got, right? So why am I doing that? So 58, 59 frames per second without any upscaling. Let's call it 60. So let's just go ahead and enable ray tracing here. I just want to see what the performance head is like. Not that you should be using ray tracing at 4K without any upscaling. Like we won't get 7 frames per second. I'm pretty sure it'll just, there we go, 14 frames per second. That's exactly what you want, right? Now you've got a lot of time to look at each individual frame, admire the beauty of it. Anyway, okay, so 15, 14 frames per second, definitely not what you want. Anyway, I don't think I know any person that's comfortable playing at this frame rate. I know people that are comfortable playing at 30 frames per second, 15 frames per second, maybe not. So I'm not sure. Maybe we should be using quite aggressive upscaling here, right? So let's just do DLSS balance. Let's just see what kind of performance we are getting. We might not do a full benchmark run here. So DLSS balanced is not going to get us 60 frames per second, and DLSS performance might. So like DLSS performance at 4K is definitely better than DLSS performance at 1440p. It does render internally at a higher resolution because it has to upscale to 4K then. Not the worst experience, I'm going to say that. Our average should probably be just below 60 frames per second here. So if you're aiming for 60 frames per second, DLSS performance at 4K is usable, not advisable. Sorry, the weather is quite bad here, so I just had to cut that out and run it a little bit. So now you can see that there is one or two stutters again. Anyway, so our average here is actually 60 frames per second, but our lows aren't that good, especially our 0.1% lows. And like, sure, we can go to ultra performance, but then that's 720p upscaled to 4K and definitely not worth it in my opinion. So let's just go ahead and enable frame generation with these settings, and that's without path tracing even. Okay, so let's just do frame generation here, and we were doing performance. Okay, so once again, I'm just showing you what the performance is like, and we're not recommending these settings. That's not that's not what I'm doing, but frame generation actually helps quite a bit now. Like sometimes, as I showed you in the previous video, sometimes it helps very little at 4K, and other times it seems to help quite a bit. Like now, we gained like more than 20 frames per second enabling frame generation. So we went from 60 to 80 frames per second. That's a 33% increase in performance, sometimes even more. Like there's almost 100 frames per second there. So definitely test it yourself. See what kind of settings work for you. I'm just here to test a few settings to give you an idea, and you can definitely take it from there. But actually not the worst experience. Like funnily enough, it's not the worst when it comes to input latency. It actually feels slightly better than similar frame rates at 1440p, but with less aggressive upscaling. Like I'm not entirely sure how to explain it exactly. Like maybe NVIDIA should just send me an LDAT and we can measure the input latency. Anyway, so let's see if we can do path tracing at 4K. Spoiler alert, we won't be able to, but let's just see what kind of settings we need to use, or what's the highest frame rate we can get when we use path tracing at 4K. Okay, so I'm going to use DLSS ultra performance there, right? So it's still on the 4K medium preset, DLSS Ultra Performance and Frame Generation is enabled, and now we're just going to enable path tracing, and ray reconstruction is now enabled as well. So it's a slightly better performance with it enabled in this game. I still don't think we'll get a good experience here. Okay, I was slightly underestimating it. Let's just see what happens if we disable frame generation. Okay, so this is with path tracing, DLSS Ultra Performance. Okay, color me impressed. Like show, it's the 720p internal resolution. Nobody should be playing 720p in 2024. Like sure, it's being upscaled to 4K, but you'll know that it's 720p. It'll definitely be some telling factors if you start actually looking at the image. It might not come across well in the YouTube video, just because obviously I'm recording this with an external capture card. You have recording settings there, so it's not set to the highest quality recording. I'm recording in 1440p. Then YouTube, the YouTube compression comes in as well. So like in a YouTube video, you probably won't see it, but if you play the game, you'll know. You'll definitely know it's 720p. All right. I think that's it. I'm just going to enable frame generation quickly. Like 90, we saw it earlier. We got around 90 frames per second, right? So let's just do ultra performance once again, and like 90 frames per second. Input latency acceptable, not good, but not bad either. Like personally, I wouldn't play like this. You will definitely miss a lot of your shots, especially if you're trying to be more accurate, trying to land headshots, etc. It's not going to work. It's not, but as I said, it's not the worst. Like some people would be able to play like this. Plug in a controller and you'll be able to play perfectly fine, I believe, because the controllers aren't really that sensitive to input latency. But this is not 720p internal resolution is not what this game is what was made for, right? It's supposed to be a pretty good looking, visually impressive game, and 720p kind of spoils that a little bit. All right, that's going to be it for both these videos. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.